You wanted to dive into South Korea, huh?
Oh,
Well, you really picked a fascinating time for it.
oh yeah. That's
I mean, we usually think of South Korea as, K-pop and all the cool tech coming out of there. But this week, things took a pretty serious turn. Like, imagine
well,
it's Tuesday night, December 4th in Seoul. People are just getting ready for bed, and bam, President Yoon Suk Yeol makes this surprise TV address.
yeah, and he goes and declares martial law.
Just like that.
It kind of throws the whole country into a tailspin.
It's a huge deal, right? I mean,
Right.
martial law basically means the military steps in, they start running things, sometimes even suspending people's rights.
It is,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Usually it's something you only see in like
Yeah.
extreme emergencies.
Exactly. And not in a modern democracy like South Korea, especially when you consider, their history. This is an ancient history for them. It brings back memories of their fight for democracy. I mean, the last time they had martial law was back in 1980
Oh, wow.
during a really big uprising.
That's right.
So you can see why everyone's kind of freaking out.
Absolutely. It brings up a lot of sensitive memories for South Koreans.
Yeah.
And to really get why this is such a big deal, you got to understand their political system. So you got the president, Yoon Suk Yeol, and then you've got the parliament, which right now is controlled by the opposition party.
Okay.
Both have a good amount of power. And to pass laws, they got to work together,
Right.
which sounds good in theory, checks and
Yeah.
balances,
Yeah.
But lately, it's been creating a ton of tension.
So what pushed President Yoon to do something this drastic? I mean, in his speech, he accused the opposition of being anti-state and even sympathizing with North Korea. Those are some serious accusations, especially on the Korean Peninsula.
Definitely. He specifically called them out for blocking his policies and even trying to impeach some of his top people, like they've been trying to get rid of the broadcasting watchdog and the state auditor, saying they're not being impartial.
And weren't they also trying to impeach some prosecutors, too? What was that all about?
Oh, yeah. That whole thing gets even more interesting because it ties back to accusations about stock manipulation against the First Lady, Yoon's wife. The opposition claims those prosecutors didn't really investigate it properly.
Oh, wow.
So it adds this whole other layer of drama to the situation.
It's like a real-life political thriller unfolding.
So UN declares martial law. What happens next? How does the country react?
It's total chaos. Think lawmakers literally pushing past soldiers to get into parliament for these emergency meetings, protests breaking out in the streets, everyone glued to their TVs trying to figure out what's going on. I can't even imagine being there in Seoul that night. It must have been so unsettling.
I bet. And the opposition parties, I'm assuming they didn't just sit back and take
Oh,
it.
no. They immediately condemned it, called
Right.
it an attack on democracy. But here's where things get really wild.
Yeah.
Even people from Yoon's own party started turning against him. The head of his own party actually went public, demanded an explanation, and even apologized.
Ouch.
Yeah, talk about pressure from all sides.
So what happened next? Did the standoff just keep going? Well, by dawn, after only 6 hours, Yoon backed down with it. He lifted the martial law declaration. It makes you wonder what was going through his head. Was it the pressure from his own party, maybe international condemnation, or did he realize he'd gone too far?
That's such a good point. But even though he backed down, it's not like he admitted defeat.
Not at all. Instead of apologizing or explaining himself, he doubled down, blamed the opposition for blocking his agenda.
Wow.
It really shows how stuck they are in this political stalemate. Remember, the election back in April gave the opposition control of parliament. And it's basically been holding Yoon back from doing what he wants.
I see.
So this whole martial law thing seems like the result of him getting really frustrated with the gridlock.
So it's a classic power struggle, but with incredibly high stakes. And this isn't just some internal squabble. This has major implications for the U.S. and the whole world, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. South Korea is a super important U.S. ally. They've got like 30,000 American troops stationed there. And there's this mutual defense treaty between the U.S. and South Korea, which means the U.S. has to defend them if they get attacked. So any instability in South Korea is a big deal for the U.S.
And when we talk about instability, it's not just about the politics, right? We have to think about what's going on with North Korea and China, and even the war in Ukraine.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head there. So let's start with North Korea. They've always been a source of tension on the peninsula, and they're constantly looking for any weakness in the South. With all this chaos going on, there's a real worry that North Korea could take advantage of the situation. Maybe they'll ramp up their military actions or launch some cyber attacks. Who knows?
You mentioned Ukraine, too. What's the connection there?
Well, remember, North Korea has been backing Russia in the war. They've even been sending them weapons, which has definitely strained things on the international stage. Now imagine if South Korea, a key U.S. ally, becomes even more unstable. It could embolden North Korea to give even more support to Russia, which could drag out the conflict in Ukraine and make global tensions even worse.
Wow, so this whole thing in South Korea, it's not just contained there. It could have ripple effects all over the world. It's like one little thing could unravel everything. But let's focus back on South Korea for a minute. Yoon backed down from martial law, but is this really the end of it? The opposition is already talking about impeachment, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. 6 opposition parties have already put forward a bill to impeach Yoon, and it seems like things are moving pretty fast.
What are the chances it actually happens, though?
That's tough to say. Here's the thing. To impeach a president in South Korea, you need a 2/3 majority vote in parliament. Now, the opposition does have the majority right now, but they'd still need some votes from Yoon's own party to get there. It's like a high-stakes game of chess.
So you're saying it's a long shot, but not impossible? What happens if they actually get enough votes?
Then it goes to the Constitutional Court. They're like the final judges in this. They look at the whole case and decide whether to kick the president out of office. It's meant to protect their constitution and prevent anyone from abusing their power.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty solid system. But even if Yoon doesn't get impeached, this whole thing has to have hurt his presidency, right?
Oh, definitely. His authority has taken a big hit.
Mm.
The public is scrutinizing everything he does. The opposition is putting on the pressure. And even his own party is starting to doubt him.
And on top of all the political pressure, there's also the potential damage to their economy. You mentioned earlier that the biggest labor union is threatening a general strike if Yoon doesn't resign. What would that do to South Korea's economy, and how would it affect things here?
That's a really important point. South Korea is a global economic powerhouse, especially for tech and manufacturing. They're a major part of those global supply chains.
Yeah.
Smartphones, cars, computer chips, things people use every day.
Yeah.
A general strike could really mess up production, lead to shortages, and make prices skyrocket. That means those things you buy from South Korea could get way more expensive or harder to find.
So this political crisis could actually hit people's wallets all over the world. It really shows you how something happening on one side of the planet can have consequences everywhere.
Exactly. And it raises some really big questions about how stable democracies are in today's world. We're seeing more populism, more political division, and more people willing to challenge the way democracies work. This situation in South Korea might be a small example of the challenges democracies are facing globally.
Wow, it's a lot to take in. With everything that's happening, is there any way out of this for South Korea? What are the possible scenarios from here?
Well, I think the best case scenario, and it's probably the hardest one to pull off, is that President Yoon finds a way to actually work with the opposition. Like maybe he makes some compromises on his policies, tries to bridge the gap, and rebuild some of that trust. But that would mean a big change in how he's been handling things.
Yeah, so far he's really been digging his heels in, blaming everyone else instead of admitting he might have made some mistakes.
Exactly. So the other possibility, and honestly probably the more likely one, is that things just stay messy. We could see even more protests, more fights between the government and the opposition, maybe even attempts to derail the whole impeachment process.
And wouldn't that just make things worse for South Korea's economy and hurt their reputation internationally?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the human side of all this. The people living in South Korea right now, they're dealing with so much uncertainty, worrying about their jobs, their future. It's a really stressful and divisive situation for the whole country.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the politics and the global impact. But at the end of the day, this is about real people's lives. What about how the public sees Yoon? Have people completely turned against him?
It's pretty split right now.
Mm-hmm.
He's still got some supporters, mostly conservative voters, but his approval ratings have been tanking since he got elected. And this martial law thing, even though it was short-lived, probably didn't help. Seeing soldiers in the streets and being reminded of those dark days of authoritarian rule, it really hits home for a lot of people. It shows them just how much is at stake for South Korea's democracy.
Which brings us back to their history again, right? South Korea's transition from authoritarian rule to democracy wasn't easy, and it wasn't that long ago. For a lot of people there, this isn't just politics, it's personal.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to how civil society reacts in the coming weeks. Will the protests get bigger? Will the labor unions actually go on strike? The amount of pressure from the public could really decide what happens next.
We've talked about how this could affect the U.S., North Korea, and Ukraine. What about everyone else? Are other countries getting involved at all?
The whole world's watching this unfold. The U.S., being South Korea's biggest ally, is in a tough spot. They want to support South Korea's democracy, But they also need things to be stable in the region, especially with all the tension with North Korea and China. It's a tricky balance to strike.
It sounds like there are a lot of moving pieces and a lot of uncertainty. As this story develops, what should we be paying attention to? What are the key things to watch for?
Well, definitely keep an eye on those impeachment proceedings. If they start gaining traction, it could force Yoon to step down or even get removed from office. And even if it doesn't get that far, the whole process will tell us a lot about who really holds the power in South Korea.
Besides the impeachment, what else should we be looking at?
Look out for any signs that things are escalating, both inside South Korea and internationally.
Yeah.
Will the protests get bigger and more intense? Will North Korea do something provocative? How will the U.S. and other countries react? Those are the kinds of things that will give us clues about where this whole crisis is headed.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. It's given me, and I'm sure our listener too, a much better understanding of what's happening in South Korea and how it affects the world.
It definitely highlights that democracy is fragile, even in a country with such a strong democratic history like South Korea. It takes constant effort and participation.
Yeah.
And a willingness to stand up for its principles.
Well said. So, as we continue to follow this unfolding story, we really have to ask ourselves, what does this whole crisis in South Korea tell us about the state of democracy around the world today? And what lessons can we learn from it, both as individuals and as a global community? Those are some important questions to think about as we watch this drama play out.